Uh, Everybody else who's walking around the outskirts of the market, do come in, join us. I'm going to be talking a little bit about our nature emergency. So come and listen if you're interested in this subject. There's plenty of time. Everybody over there, come forward. Listen to what we've got to say about the crisis the nature is facing right now. Right, I'm just first of all going to give you a little bit of background about who I am. I'm the Green Party's national spokesperson for nature. So I've got a natural role of trying to explain to people why this is such an important issue and hopefully try and get change at a local and a national level. I'm also an elected county councillor here at Durham County Council for the Green Party. First of all, I want to talk to you about what's being described right now as the attack on nature. And there's a national campaign going on right now about the attack on nature, and this is being driven forward by organisations like the National Trust, like the wildlife trusts, like the RSPB. Honestly, these, are socially conservative organisations. And they have used the term attack on nature. So I think that tells you a little bit about how extreme what's happening right now is considered. That these moderate organisations who really normally don't get that involved in politics and that sort of campaigning are trying to put their foot down. Because we've got a bunch of things that have been announced very recently. A lot of them, the announcements coincided with what's been called the mini budget. So we've had the introduction of what's called enterprise zones. These are a term that now is starting to replace the idea of free ports. You might have heard the term free ports. And of course, free ports, the idea behind them was that there would just be a relaxation of taxation and broader regulations in specific zones to try and encourage business and growth. But enterprise zones have replaced them, and enterprise zones are basically the same thing, but covering a much wider area. So it's not just the port, the area immediately surrounding it. The enterprise zones can push right into the countryside, cross our national parks and all sorts of areas where you'd really expect there to be quite a high degree of protection for wildlife. So there's a real concern there. Obviously, on the back of the energy crisis and cost of living crisis, we've also had the resurgence of interest in oil, gas and fracking. So fracking, that was previously ruled out in our country, is now back with a vengeance. And of course, I'm sure you're all asking the question, what's the point of all that? Why is that beneficial? How does that help? When the obvious, intuitive solution to everybody is that we should get rid of our dependency on fossil fuels, on oil and gas. Why are we doing the reverse of that? Why simply can't we be really focusing on getting more renewable energy online? There are so many planning applications that have already been passed around the country for these things to happen, and instead we're supercharging oil, gas and fracking again. So again, very concerned about that. You might have come across something called the ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, that was going to replace what's previously been called the Common Agricultural Policy. So the Common Agricultural Policy was something that European government had delivered probably for about 60 years or so. And that's a farming subsidy scheme. That's inaccurate to describe it that way. That's a subsidy scheme that gives people money based on how much land they own. So the idea is that money will go into food production, but there's no guarantee that that will happen. Essentially, the money gets given to people based on how much land they own. And so it's been heavily criticised because of that. Basically, something that rewards very wealthy people with even more money. Now, criticised for many decades, and we're all thinking, well, the one positive thing that might come out of Brexit is the reform of this particular funding scheme with the Environmental Land Management Scheme. So farmers would instead get paid a subsidy that will be locked into making improvements on their land for wildlife. So, hooray, a single victory out of the whole thing. Even that now is under threat. So we'll be going back to, and this is no doubt as a result of major landowners lobbying government to say, actually, we don't want that money to be tied to making improvements for wildlife. We just want the money. So quite literally, through abandoning that scheme, the government's going to be putting about £1.5 billion into paying really rich people, depending on how much land they've got. So I just think that's unjust and a massive, massive wasted opportunity. And the final thing I want to mention to you in relation to what I call the attack on nature is the bonfire of the regulations. So very recently we've had the announcement that, well, I'm getting dripped on here. We had an announcement that as part of Brexit, that all of the various environmental regulations that protected nature would be simply transferred over. And that there was no worry, nothing to see here, no threat whatsoever. Now we find that that's not the case at all, and all of these regulations, and there's hundreds of them, are simply going to be ripped up. And the government's line on that is that the Environment Act is sufficient to provide for all of the various protections that we need. And it simply goes nowhere close being sufficient to replace what's being lost. Let me give you some examples of pieces of legislation that are simply going to be scrapped. The Wastewater Treatment Directive. I think we all appreciate the significance of that right now. That's out the window. And there are other bits and pieces as well. So I don't want to keep going on about this forever. So that basically is a summary of what's called the attack, what I'm calling the attack on nature. So do search for that, and you'll see what the RSPB and the National Trust and other organisations are saying in relation to that, and what you can do about it as well. More importantly, what actions you can take. In particular, write to your Conservative councillors in relation to this. Let's just think about some of the global impacts that are happening to nature right now. I just want to mention to you that the ice sheets are retracting. That's obviously very concerning from a wildlife perspective, also from a human perspective because of the impact on sea levels. What are we doing as a response to the ice sheets retracting? We're seeing it as an opportunity to exploit new areas for oil. As the ice retreats, we're quite literally going in and saying, well, hey, there's new gas and oil that we can now access that was previously covered by ice. We know what's happening with regards to deforestation, and particularly our important rainforests on the planet. There's a little ray of hope. There's the one thing in my entire speech that is potentially positive, and that's that we might have a new government in Brazil right now, who might start to reverse some of the tremendous damage that President Bolsonaro has done in relation to deforestation of the Amazon rainforest, which has increased massively in his term in office. So President De Silva, I think it is, it's likely that he'll be elected. And so there's a bit of hope there. And of course, the other global aspect, just one last thing that I want to mention to you on this, is our ocean floors. As we're running out of minerals and resources and nature on terrestrial side of the planet, we're simply moving our focus to the ocean floors. And this is where big mining is happening right now, in a very unregulated way, with very little understanding as to the actual impact that it's having on oceanic ecosystems. It's just going ahead in a pretty much unregulated way. So I've talked to you all about nature, about the impact, about the attack on nature that's happening right now, but I just now want to mention, why is nature so important? Why am I banging on about this? It's not because it's pretty, it's nice to have around. It's a cultural thing, it's a friendly thing, it's a cute and cuddly, furry thing. It's nothing to do with that. It's because it relates to your very survival on this planet. We are actually a part of natural ecosystems. Our survival is dependent on their health. And if you can't really understand that connection clearly, well, I invite you to take a breath and remind you that all of the oxygen in the air you just breathed came from a plant. every single molecule. And we really have no perception whatsoever as to the impact we're having on these natural systems that actually create the very air we breathe. So it's not about something that's nice to have, it's about our very survival on the planet. You know, there's a selfish angle to this as well. By looking after nature, we are actually looking after ourselves. And it seems nonsensical to me that that basic, GCSE level biology doesn't factor into political thinking. I want to mention to you also a little bit about what I call the carbon cycle. Well, not just me, the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle is the idea that carbon dioxide in the air coming out of a plant that we breathe out is taken back in by plants. That's the carbon cycle, and previously for millions of years it's been in balance. So the amount of carbon dioxide that's put out through respiration is taken in by photosynthesis. So that cycle balances the whole thing out. It's a natural cycle. The reason we have the climate emergency is because we've been exceeding the capacity of that natural cycle. So we've exceeded the capacity of plants on this planet to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We're putting it in the air too fast, quite simply. We've gone past the capacity of this natural cycle. So think of it like that. Don't think of it as something that is separate. It's not, it's not a human thing. It's actually a natural thing. And nature is the regulator of our atmosphere, and we're destroying its capacity to actually look after that. Why is it accelerating? Well, one simple answer to that is that we use more oil, gas, coal, burn more wood at Drax than we previously did, or ever have done. And that trend of increasing carbon emissions has been going on, to be honest, for about 200 years, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, really, starting when we started using coal in considerable quantities. And it's accelerated, and it's actually still accelerating. So what's driving that acceleration? Why do we need all this energy? Well, quite simply, it's to fuel growth, economic growth. It's demanded by economic growth. If we're going to have economic growth, it needs to be fueled by energy, by stuff. Now, the problem with measuring your economy on the basis of economic growth, there is a real issue here. You're measuring success. If you want to demonstrate your economy has been successful, is healthy, that's generally done by saying it's going back into growth. But increasing growth forces an increasing consumption of natural resources, it forces an increasing consumption of energy, and it forces an increasing generation of waste coming out the other end. Now, I've talked to economists about this on numerous occasions, and they've all said to me, oh, the solution is simple. We simply decouple growth from natural resources. So I've read into that and looked, and honestly, it can't be done. It can be done to a certain extent. You can reach a sort of maximum efficiency in terms of reducing the amount of resources that do fuel your economy. But when you get to that maximum efficiency, that maximum decoupling efficiency, all it takes is a bit more growth and you're back to square one. It's because of the exponential relationship that exists in the... growth is only measured as positive if you get more growth one year than you get the last year. It's an exponential relationship. If you have the same amount of growth one year than the last year, growth is measured at zero. So there's a real issue in the way we measure the health of our economy. It should be measured on the basis of how well it provides for our basic needs. Whether or not it gives us food, whether or not it gives us a roof over our head. Those sorts of things. There needs to be a suite of metrics that actually ask the question, is our economy providing for our basic needs? It should be measured on the extent to which it avoids busting what you might consider natural boundaries. So we've got to try and grow our economy to the point that it provides our basic needs, and then hold it static before it busts through natural boundaries. There are 7 or 8 of which. I'm not going to go into details. So we need a much more subtle, sensitive, clever, intelligent approach to measuring the success of our economy. And a lot of this really does come down to economics and how we measure economic success. Growth is actually the problem as an economic metric. And that's the message I really want to leave with you all today. Growth is the problem. But we here live in a country where both the mainstream parties see growth as the solution. They see that as the way right now. All the talk from the Conservatives is all about returning the country to growth. Whether they're capable of doing that is an entirely different question. I mean, frankly, growth under the Conservatives has stagnated for probably about 10 to 12 years. So that's Liz Truss. She's all about growth. She hopes that her mini-budget will return the country to growth. On the other hand, we've got the Labour Party and Keir Starmer recently quoting that he is going to supercharge growth. That's his plan. Now, there's a very good chance that he'll be reasonably successful. I don't support either of these parties, but I have to say that in the past, the Labour Party have been more successful at returning the country to growth. So, ironically, I know a lot of you might be Labour supporters, but they're going to do a whole lot more damage to the planet because they're more likely to supercharge growth and be successful at it. So, the last thing I want to mention to you is the idea of nature and rights. Are you all happy to continue hearing me talking for another few minutes? Give us a show of hands.
Yes.
Right, brilliant. I know it's hard to get this balance right, you know, when people are drifting away. But, okay, nature and rights. I really think another key component of saving nature on our planet is understanding the relationship, the rights relationship here. So we're used to thinking in terms of human rights. We're used to thinking actually in terms of economic rights. I know that one sounds a little bit abstract, but you know, economic structures do have rights established in law. Companies are limited. People are limited in liability. Companies can be sued. A company is, in law, an entity that exists in its own right, even though it's something that effectively is abstract. Human rights really started to arrive on the scene after the Second World War, but they started to appear in law in our country during the Industrial Revolution in Victorian times, you know, as a means of stopping the appalling treatment of children in mills and mines and that sort of thing. So human rights have evolved over a period of time. Economic rights were actually first on the scene. They appeared in terms of appearing in our legislation a long time before human rights did. You might think, well, that's a bit of a strange order. Why did economic rights come first? Well, that's because rich people have more influence over lawmaking, and they wanted to protect their interests. So company law goes back much, much earlier than actually human rights law does. So we've got a human rights law, we've got economic law. Have we got any rights for nature in law? Actually, no, we haven't. They're not around yet. But our survival is dependent on the survival of nature. I've talked about this already. But for us to survive, we need healthy ecosystems. Our survival is actually dependent on the survival of nature. It's not the other way round. Nature's survival isn't dependent on us. In fact, I think nature's survival is probably quite threatened by us. So if you want to establish a hierarchy of rights, surely it has to have nature at the bottom, because that provides all of our stuff. It fuels our economy. We wouldn't have anything were it not for natural resources. I'm not just thinking about the living side of nature. I'm thinking about all of the water, the minerals, the air that we breathe, the entire natural system. It has to have rights, and its protection has to be, its survival has to be protected in law. through establishing rights. Human rights you might then see as the next part of the pyramid above that, and economic rights potentially the next part of the pyramid above that. Economies, what do they actually do? Well, in their essence, all they're doing is managing the relationship between humans and nature, regulating the stuff we consume, who owns it, who it belongs to. They are simply an abstract structure that enables that to happen, that right now is dysfunctional. And that rights relationship actually needs to be that we currently have economic rights first, human rights second, nature rights don't exist at all. That rights relationship has to be flipped on its head completely for us to move forwards and understand how we can save life on this planet. I'm hoping to lead the production of a Rights of Nature bill, working with parliamentarians over the next year. It'll be presented as a private member's bill by one of our Green peers or Caroline Lucas. I'm hoping to get cross-party support for it and bring as many different organisations into the drafting of this bill as is possibly the case. And that can include Extinction Rebellion, who are well represented here, but other parties as well. We're really keen to make sure people get behind the idea of re-establishing a rights relationship that puts nature at its very foundation. And so that's, I think, something positive that might come out of this. Thank you all for listening to me. And so I hope I've left you with a few thoughts there. Thanks, folks. If anybody wants to say a few words to the microphone, if anybody wants to deliver a few impromptu speeches, that's perfectly okay. Just